Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today, and thank you to Semi-Permanent for bringing me here to this very beautiful country that I have visited before, way back in 2001, when I made a dress out of porcelain for the wearable art competition, and it won a little prize. I was in high school at the time. So it's very sentimental to be back here, which is the farthest place on the globe from New York City. Many people know me from a little movie I did a long time ago called Mean Girls, and I have a YouTube channel now which puts me in the public eye, but the people closest to me know that my happiest place is really when I'm alone and when I'm doing something with my hands that's creative, usually when I'm making something. I've turned one of my hobbies into a business. I do calligraphy out of New York in pen and ink. I also do chalk work for restaurants and cafes. I write the menus in chalk. I do some sign painting. It's tricky making a living in New York. Once you actually establish a business there, it does feel like a real source of pride. Here is one of the signs I painted on the storefront of a store that I love so much. So it's nice to be able to make money from things that started off as a hobby, but I continue to give time to the quiet things that I just love to do for myself. I love knitting. I always carry knitting with me, especially when I'm traveling. I have a hat in the hotel room that I'm working on, and there's no pressure to get it done. It's 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. Certain things I dive into and I kind of just approach very casually. I teach myself, or I read books about how to do something like wood carving, and I try my hand at it. And other things, like pottery, if I realize that it's something I really want to invest more time in, I dive deep. And when it's something like this, with pottery, there's a certain point where I always realize there's only so far I can go before I need to seek actual instruction. And for me, when I'm seeking a teacher, I look to someone whose work just floors me, whose work I admire so much that whatever they tell me to do, I'm going to listen to them. And for pottery, I found that in someone named Guy Wolf. He's a very well-known flower pot maker. He makes flower pots for the most famous people in the States. He made all of Steve Jobs' flower pots for his estate, and I begged Guy to teach me, and he said no at first, and then I wrote him a letter in calligraphy, and then he relented and said okay, and I've been going to him for 13 years. This is his shop. These are his flower pots. They're all inspired by very old shapes from the 19th and 18th century, and that's why I really felt I connected to his work. His actual shop and workroom is in a very old building from the 1700s, and going up there is kind of like escaping from the real world and going back in time. But the actual task requires quite a bit of discipline. And when I first went there, the pots that I was making, they were okay, but they weren't anywhere near what I wanted them to be. And it's really taken 13 years of doing it over and over and over again to get to this state where the pots are uniform, they're all the same shape, they're the same size, and they can actually be sold in his shop. So it feels like a major accomplishment and a wonderful thing to be able to give back to this person who believed in me by making things that he can finally sell. Other things are a lot more daunting. Painting and drawing, those are sort of the tenets of classical art. And those things are things that I feel they move into a different realm. It's not pottery, it's not woodworking or knitting. Someone can show you how they paint, but then it's really up to you to figure out how to take a piece of yourself and put that into a painting. So it's something that I've done on the side. I knew that eventually I would come across someone's work who just made me go, this is it. Now I want to learn how to do it like this. Unfortunately, that man was dead. This is John Singer Sargent, who is considered one of the finest portrait painters of all time. was born in 1856, died in 1925, and during his heyday in the 1880s to about 1910, he was really the most sought after portraitist for high society in Europe. This is my favorite painting of his, Lady Agnew, and I've known about this painting for a very long time. I'd seen it in books and obsessed over it, and last month I got to see it for the very first time at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And I stood in front of it and I cried. Because Lady Agnew, the thing about Sargent's work is that it's not overworked. He had this brilliance to be able to paint things very quickly with such confidence. He knew how to mix the right color and put it in the right place. It sounds simple, but when I was standing so close to that painting, I mean, if you look at this arm and the chair, they're just single quick strokes, but you step away from it and you see her, and she's alive, and that's the magic of Sargent. So I knew that if I wanted to learn how to paint like Sargent, I would eventually have to try to find someone who could teach me his techniques. But I also knew I just had to dive right in, and that's what I did. I knew that I really wanted to do this the real old way, to paint from life and not to paint from photographs. Sargent painted his sitters from life. They would have to dress up and sit in front of him. So I recruited all my friends to sit for me, and it is agonizing. It really is. There's a breaking point where they go, I can't do this anymore, I need to get up. And they leave, and this is my friend Corinne, and this is a model that came and sat for me. The painting from life is also coupled with schooling. So when I committed to doing this, I was taking anatomy classes and portrait painting classes, and I decided to really take this seriously. This is a program called the Copyist Program at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. You have to apply to get in, and I was so honored to get in last year. You choose a painting to copy, and this is a traditional way that artists learned how to paint. Sargent actually copied paintings all over Europe this way. You go in, you take your canvas, you take your paints, you set up, and you do it. The challenging part about this is that you're doing it while the museum is open. So you're focused, and someone comes up and goes, "Oh, that's so nice, what are you doing?" And you just want to say, "Shut up and leave me alone." But you can't, you have to be nice. Sometimes it works. This is another bartender that I knew that came and sat for me, and at the end of 6 hours, I had a painting that I felt, wow, it looks like him, and then other times it doesn't work. And at the end of 5, 6, 7 hours of your friend sitting for you, I erase the canvas and I wipe it down. And the wonderful thing about this is that Sargent did the same thing. Not all of his attempts were successful. There were many, he was notorious for not being satisfied with a painting, sometimes after 10 sittings. And he would just wipe it down, and the patron would be furious. Like, what do you mean you're wiping that down? I've spent 20 hours posing for you, but if it wasn't good enough for him, then he just started over. So just diving in and doing it myself, but always going back to the master. So this is a beautiful study of an Egyptian girl by Sargent that's in Chicago, and the wonderful thing about being able to visit these museums and see these pieces is that they're very different when you're seeing them in person. Sargent painted portraits for a living, and there came a point in his life when he didn't want to do it anymore. He was just fed up with high society and the demands that they put on him. They would say things like, "What's wrong with the nose?" And he'd say, "That's your nose." so he later in life focused on the work that he just wanted to produce for himself, not for money, but really for the recognition as a painter. And the medium that he loved was watercolor. His method after he gave up portraiture was really to just pack up everything and go out into the world. When he was traveling all over Europe and even the Middle East, he would have his paints with him, and he would set up and he would paint outside. And watercolor was the wonderful medium that he used. There's Sargent painting outside. There's a famous saying, there's a sort of thing that was said in the 19th century about watercolor, that watercolor is used at the beginning of your life and at the end of your life as a painter. You start with watercolor as a child naively because it's safe and it's easy to use. You wet the paints, you paint. This is a painting that Sargent did when he was 12 years old. And it's nice. I hear some gasps. It's so funny because I'm going to use this as a bad example. He did this when he was 12. But really, in classical painting, you learn very early on that watercolor is the most daunting medium there is to paint in because it's unforgiving. There's no going back. In oils, you can scrape the canvas down. It's layered. You build up with oils, whereas with watercolor, it's the opposite. In oils, if I want to put a highlight on a person's face, I do that at the very end. I mix the lightest color for the tip of their nose or the glint in their eye, and that's the last thing, the white, that you place on the painting, and you step away. But with watercolor, it's the opposite. The white is the white of the paper, and in order to maintain that highlight, you have to leave it alone from the very beginning. And once it's ruined, once it's covered, it's over. The painting's done. There's no fussing around, scraping, trying to erase it, and everyone can see when that happens. So I use this example as the bad example because this is watercolor used in a very careful, calculated way. But it's not the medium used in the way it wants to be used. Things like clay and paint, they're inanimate objects, but there is a way to take the medium and use it to its fullest potential. And later in Sargent's life, he was using watercolor in a way that academics now would consider properly. This is pure mastery of this medium. It's taking the watercolor and it's using it in a way where you can see that there are risks, and he's just done it so boldly. The bleeding of the colors together, the areas where he's just put the swashes on very, very quickly, that is a hand of confidence. And the way the colors are also used is it's not completely trying to accurately reflect what he's seeing. It's an interpretation of the scene. The two main colors in this painting are orange and blue, which are complementary on the color wheel. And he's a master because he's using it to its ultimate potential. Another Sargent watercolor of Venice. Again, you can clearly see how different it is from that painting of the mountains. So, in many of his paintings of watercolor, the real time that is taken is to do a pencil underdrawing, especially if there's architecture involved. There are lines that were made with rulers. The perspective is very accurate. And then, once the pencil is in and he starts painting, that's all done very quickly. And it's done without hesitation. And there's no really room for reworking anything. Watercolor again. Sargent's mastery of his technique is also how he chose to frame things. He did unusual croppings. To a novice painting this church would think, oh, I have to include the sky and I have to include the top of the church, the pediment. But he cuts things off in unusual ways to show a perspective that's actually much more compelling than what you or I might assume we should paint. His subject matter, too, shows us that the most mundane thing can be beautiful. Here are two examples of Sargent pieces, both from Venice. On the left is an oil, and on the right is watercolor. So in the oil, all of those highlights are put in later at the end. And the one on the right, the watercolor, all of those lights have to be maintained through the whole painting. So there came a certain point where I decided, okay, I think I'm going to take the very delicate step into trying to paint in watercolors. And it started off as just kind of playing. I had my set of watercolors and I was doing my thing, but I really knew that I had no idea what I was doing. And like pottery, I realized I have to find a teacher. But it is really, really hard to find a teacher. And as I said, finding someone whose work just inspires you, that's not easy, especially for me with watercolors. So it happened almost by chance through Instagram. I found someone named Marcelo Del Doce, who works out of Philadelphia and teaches in New York. There's Marcelo, and on the right is one of his paintings in watercolor. Here's another one of his paintings. It was after following him and looking at his work for some time that I reached out and contacted him and asked him about teaching me, and he agreed to give me private lessons. This is a painting of his of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and what's really interesting is when I met Marcelo, I discovered that he was also a huge fan of Sargent. Sargent's work really inspired him, and then it all kind of made sense that that's why I was really taken by his work. So Marcelo came over and we started at the very beginning, and he warned me about how difficult it was to paint in watercolor. But he also set it up so that I would be starting with very baby steps. He said, I know you know how to paint, I know you know how to draw, but in order to learn how to use this properly, you have to start at the very beginning, and that's what we did. We started with just washes. He would do a wash on the page, and he would say, okay, I want you to do this with no streaks, and these are my examples on the left, sorry. And there are streaks through the whole thing. So even just this basic process took a lot of time to nail down. And from there, we went to painting still with just one color in 3 tones, the process of layering, painting a very light base, then a second tone with a thicker paint, and then the final tone, which was the darkest. And it was amazing to see on the left is Marcelo's version, and on the right was something I did, a copy of a Sargent watercolor, how effective it was. Marcelo is just a great teacher. We moved to painting 2 colors. This is just a 2-color wash, and then more colors. And then we actually moved to painting actual subjects. So here's Marcelo in my apartment painting a scene that it's a view from the gym that I go to, and I took a picture of it and said, I'd like to paint this. So the way our lessons worked is we would paint side by side. Marcelo would do it, and then he would get up and he would say, okay, now you do it. So Marcelo demonstrating, and this was my version of the gym window. We also went to painting the figure. Marcelo gives classes in watercolor painting of the figure. And this was great because it really forced me to paint quickly. Marcelo kept saying, move on, move on, move on. Don't fuss. Don't stay in the same place. You need to use the paint in the way that shows it off. And this was great because we had a model and there was a timer, and these poses were 1 or 2 minute poses. So the timer would go off, and then the model would change his pose, and you would have to paint something else. And these were just two colors. Same thing with this. In this class, we had homework exercises where we would copy paintings in watercolor. And these homework exercises were great because I would do them at my desk. Here are 2 versions. There's the horrible version of attempting to paint her shadow and it looking like she's covered in charcoal. and then doing it again, learning from the mistake. Another homework exercise. Marcelo's class took us to the Met to actually look at Sargent watercolors, like the actual original watercolors. They have a wonderful collection there, and their curator pulled them out for Marcelo and the class, and we got to actually see them, which was kind of like a spiritual experience, seeing Sargent's watercolors. Watercolor is not something that you can display because it fades under light, so Sargent watercolors, they're not publicly seen very often. More homework exercises. So this was about a year of sitting at my desk and taking classes with Marcelo. And then over the summer, this past summer, I went to Italy for an art course, and I was there for 6 weeks, and I decided I was going to take my watercolor palette with me, and I was going to go out and try to paint outside. And this was kind of the big step, moving from the safety of my desk and painting from photographs and actually being outside and painting from real life. And so much changes. The light is changing. Things don't stay still. People interrupt you. It's chaos. But there was such an unexpected joy about the challenge of doing this. This is a fountain in Bologna, and this is Sargent painting that fountain. So I knew about this painting, about the Sargent's watercolor of this fountain, and seeing the actual fountain. The fountain's ridiculous. I mean, look what's happening. It's like, I didn't believe this was real, and then I saw it, and I'm like, what the hell is this fountain? But I attempted to paint it. It was kind of garbage. This is also in Bologna. This little alley, it's called Via delle Bracche in Florence, and Sargent painted this little alley. So when I found this alley, it was like, wow, I'm actually standing exactly where he stood, and I'm painting this. And the unexpected thing about painting from life was that you think everything is going to stay still, and it doesn't. You draw, like I would draw everything with pencil, and then I would mix my colors, and sometimes the sun would be shining, and as soon as I would go to put the wash down, a rain cloud would move, and all the colors would change, and I would just end up kind of laughing like a crazy person, because it was the world showing me, I'm not waiting for you. And this was part of the beauty of this process, is an aspect of humility that I didn't anticipate. The humility to know that I was following it. It was not there for me. I would go back to the same place over and over. That's another thing that a part of classical art training is don't just paint things once. The way you actually learn is by doing it over and over again in different situations. Maybe when it's raining, maybe when it's sunny, different perspectives and croppings of the same scene. I painted every day in Florence. And the thing that I've also learned through all of the different disciplines that I've entered is to not be too hard on myself. And there's a very fine line here. I know when I'm being lazy and when I'm not paying attention, but I also know that I'm learning and I have to be easy on myself. And this process was really daunting, going out there and painting from life. And sometimes I would look at the work and I would really see, like, this is real garbage. But it takes making the garbage in order to get to a place where it's good. It took 12 years of making bad flower pots in order to get to the place where the flower pots are beautiful and worthy of being sold. So I knew that this process was something that was what I needed to go through. And it was dirty. I don't know how many of you have been to Florence, but Florence is dirty. It's like, and when I was painting, I would have to, I don't have a table and a chair or anything, so I would just have to figure things out. And with this one, I just pulled an e-bike over and put my palette on the e-bike. Sometimes I was like squatting in a gutter. And once I went home and I realized that fleas had bitten me because I was squatting in the gutter, it was disgusting. But the thing that I was trying to do that Sargent did so well, what he was a master of, was capturing the feeling of light. This is really what he's known for. There's a quote about owning a Sargent painting, that to own a Sargent painting is to own sunlight captured and enjoyed. And I saw it all over Florence. I saw the buildings with this beautiful golden light on them, and I would just yearn to be able to put that on the page. But it's so hard. It's not just a matter of painting a shadow. In the shadow, a shadow is not just gray. A shadow is either warm or cold. And it's up to me to choose what colors to put on the paper to make it look that way. It's also this thing of sitting out there, looking at something, and trying to figure out what part of it to put on the page. I would often think, oh, this is what it is. But then I would go back to Sargent and realize, wow, this is a Sargent oil, and it's called a Stairwell in Capri. Very often I'm standing outside and I'm looking around and thinking, what am I going to paint? What am I going to paint? And I'm looking for something to paint. And when I go back to Sargent, I'm reminded so often that a master can see the beauty in almost anything. This was a spot that I went to a few times because the shadows in the morning were this beautiful blue color on this church near my Airbnb. And again, the daunting part was having the palette next to me and having to actually decide, what colors do I mix to capture this? Painting in watercolor has really taught me how to see. And it's taught me how to see life in a very different way. These aren't just images or frames that are captured in a single way. It's actually the passing of time. And when I'm sitting out there and I'm painting, the beautiful thing is that I am in the middle of something that is happening. And what is put on the page is an actual moment in time. And I've applied that to my waking hours, even when I'm not painting. We all have the choice, if we've been lucky enough to be given the gift of sight, on a daily basis, every day, every hour, every minute, you choose what you're looking at. And at the end of the day, what you've chosen to see or look at can either have a wonderful impact on your life or a negative impact on your life. And this process of understanding that, wow, I choose what to look at, it's impacted me in small and big ways. I spent 6 weeks in Florence, and it was so, despite it being dirty and hot, it was so beautiful. And at the end of this trip of being surrounded by so much beauty, I spent 2 days in Rome before my flight back to New York. And I was staying in this beautiful hotel, and there was an elevator that was supposed to take me up to my room on the 5th floor. And I remember getting in this elevator, and it was dinky, and it was smelly, and it was horrible. And I was sort of jammed in there with it was a modern elevator. It wasn't anything romantic and old, with my luggage. And when I had settled into the room and I had to go back downstairs, I didn't want to go back to the elevator because it was ugly. And I just stopped and I thought, wait, maybe there are stairs. And I found the stairwell, and the stairwell actually in the hotel happened to be very beautiful. So it was 5 flights of stairs to go downstairs, and then another 5 to come back up. And over the course of 2 days, every time I needed to go upstairs or downstairs, I decided to take the stairs. And it was a conscious decision. But that's how I live my life now, because what I saw for those last 2 days in Rome, I didn't want that to be polluted with this ugly elevator. And although it's so much work to take the stairs were beautiful. And to me, I'm willing to do the work. A similar thing happened a couple weeks ago in New York. My friends and I were going to meet in Brooklyn for a Halloween party, and we all got dressed up, and they were going to take the subway. And I knew that I didn't want to be on the subway. I didn't want to be on the subway going there, and I didn't want to be on the subway coming back home. And it's an hour bike ride to Brooklyn, but I decided I was going to ride my bike, so I had my Halloween costume on. I was dressed as Michael Jackson. And I took my bike, and I decided to ride while my friends took the subway. And as I was crossing the Williamsburg Bridge, there was a beautiful full moon over the bridge, and I was alone on the bridge. And it wasn't just a picture of the moon. For those 15 minutes as I rode over the bridge, it was like there could have been an orchestra, and there was a performance in the sky just for me of this huge moon in the sky and the clouds coming in, an indigo color to the sky, and then the moon disappearing, and then the moon revealing itself. Watercolor has also taught me to filter what I see. When I'm sitting out there and I know that that sun is going to move, this was early morning painting at about 6 in the morning. There's not a lot of time to capture that, so I have to make decisions about what I put on the page. I can't put everything on the paper, especially when it comes to painting the colors. And when I think about this filtering, I don't know why, but my mind goes back to a course that I took in university, at the University of Toronto. It was a course about Asian art. And I remember this, it's stuck in my head, of the instructor talking about Buddha and Siddhartha Gautama being born as a young prince, and his parents deciding that they didn't want him to see or experience anything unpleasant. So as he was growing up, he was shielded from the outside world. And I know that's not the point of the story, but why that has stayed with me is because it is something that parents do. You're raising a child, and you don't want your child to see the inevitable cruelty of the world and the horribleness that exists out there. But part of becoming human is actually growing up and seeing it and then accepting it. But for me, watercolor has shown me that you see everything. You see the good, you see the bad, and then you decide what you want to hold with you. And the beauty of this medium, what really hit me, was that in order to paint this light, at the beginning, the very first colors that I put on the page were the blue and the yellow that's on the walls of the building. And at that point, it kind of looks like nothing. Because this process maintains a transparency and you know what you're working towards, those early washes, you have to kind of believe that it's going to work. And the only way that the sun shines on the page is when I dip my brush into the dark color and paint the shadow. It's only when I, at the very end, pop in the very darkest color that that sun comes to life. Thank you.